Now, in connection with the increasing concern about foodborne illness associated with fresh produce, there are some responses that both industry and government are working on and developing, and I just want to talk about that for a second. In general, you can think about that as traditionally, especially in the processing industry, the concern was what's happening in the processing facility. Well, now I think there's a better understanding that that has to be pushed back into the production area. There has to be a more comprehensive system in place. And so one way that that's being done is to think about what I'm calling here food safety checkpoints. And that's both during production and during processing. So you might have a more fine-grained testing protocol to test produce in the field. Now obviously you can't test to identify contamination. There's just no way to do that. But you can do routine testing to hopefully give you an indication that there's a problem there. And so doing that before that produce comes into the facility, gets all mingled and mixed together, that's to our advantage. If we can do that earlier in the process and identify potential problem lots of material and keep that from getting mixed in, mingled in with the rest of the produce, we can stop that from getting out to the public. Third-party audits, that's been important in the food industry for a while. We're seeing an increased emphasis on that. A lot of that is not coming, at least in fresh produce, is not coming from regulatory initiatives, but rather from distributors and retailers who are demanding to see that. That's where we're seeing a lot of the action these days. A lot of interest in better monitoring. I mentioned that monitoring is not a cure or a panacea by any means, but if we can develop methods that are more sensitive and more rapid, and we have rapid methods now, but even the rapid methods we have now are 24, 48, 72 hours. If we could get that down to 12 hours to 24 hours, that would be a real boon for the industry. A lot of interest and focus these days on transportation and traceback. Transportation is an area that perhaps didn't receive a whole lot of attention in the past. There's a lot of interest in that now. We know, for example, that temperature control during transportation is something that perhaps we need to pay a little more attention to, and that has a benefit in terms of quality as well as safety. But all of this material is going to be transported in refrigerated trucks for the most part. There wasn't always a good knowledge, let's say, that if it was supposed to be 40 degrees in that truck during transportation, that it was actually 40 degrees from start to finish, or from all parts of the truck, that every part of the truck was at 40 degrees or below. So there's been a lot of research lately looking into various ways to ensure that that's the case. Traceback is part of that too. Traceback, of course, that has implications for food safety, whether it's an accidental act of contamination or whether it's an intentional act of contamination, any kind of bioterrorism event. This plays into that. So there's a real desire to have more fine-grained abilities for traceback. And obviously the more fine-grained you can make that, the more likely you are to identify where the problem occurred and what kind of control methods might be able to prevent it in the future. So even being able potentially to trace back to individual harvesters in the field or individual pieces of harvesting equipment, for example, if we can do that, that's really to our advantage. And technology may allow us to do that. Right now, it's as much a cost issue as anything else. But that equipment, that technology is becoming cheaper all the time. There is a lot of research going on in new sanitizing treatments. There are a lot of sanitizing treatments that are used in the industry, and we know that those are effective. We know that they're not 100% effective. There are a lot of nooks and crannies, regardless of what kind of produce you're talking about. There are a lot of nooks and crannies where those sanitizing agents really can't penetrate very well, and that's not even worrying about the ones that may be internalized inside the plant tissues. So there's a lot of interest in trying to come up with more effective sanitizing treatments, something that would have more penetrating power, and you can see gaseous ozone as an example of that, something that might be able to better permeate the tissue or better get down into all those nooks and crannies. That's an area where there's a lot of work yet to be done. Irradiation. You may know that irradiation was recently approved for treating iceberg lettuce and fresh spinach. Now, irradiation has been available for a long time for these products, but not at a sufficient dosage that would kill bacteria. It's very effective. The previous dosages that were approved were very effective against insect eggs and insect infestation, not high enough to kill bacteria. So this is a new thing for fresh produce, and there's a lot of interest in that. I think there's a lot of potential for it. There are some types of produce that you really couldn't use irradiation on simply because it has too extreme an effect on the quality. Really deteriorates the texture or creates off flavors, that sort of thing. But it will work on a lot of different types of fruits and vegetables. I don't know of anyone, this was approved sometime late last year as I recall, I don't know of any companies that are using this currently, and I don't know when that's likely to occur, to be perfectly honest. It's a very expensive technology to deploy, and there are still real questions about consumer acceptance of irradiated products. And most companies, understandably, are very reluctant to make that leap on their own. They don't want to deploy that technology if their competitor hasn't, without knowing whether that's going to be accepted by the consumer. Industry's role. I mentioned that industry-funded research is very useful, very effective. There are things that you can do in cooperation with industry that you simply can't do any other way. We do a lot of work in the laboratory and we get good information that way. But there's no substitute for being able to go out in an actual production or processing environment and collect data that way too. And if you want to be able to collect volumes of useful data, having an industry cooperator is the best thing in the world. And I've certainly benefited from that. So there's definitely a role for industry to play there. And finally, consumers. Mentioned this previously. Consumers have to have the final responsibility for food safety in their own homes. And I guess it's just human nature, if one becomes ill, to think that, well, it must have been something I ate at that restaurant, last week. But chances are that's not the case. Chances are it's something that happened in the home. And most foodborne illnesses can be traced to consumer handling practices. So that's something, again, that's an opportunity for education. That's something that people need to be aware of. So working together, we can ensure that fresh produce is safe as well as healthy. So just some conclusions. We need a comprehensive system for food safety and fresh produce. There is no single point at which you can intervene and cure all of the problems or eliminate all of the risks. It has to be all the way from the farm to the fork, and everyone has a responsibility there.